Picture this. You're sitting in the dark. Your curtains are drawn tight against the glass, the room is freezing, and outside, the night sky is literally tearing open.
Yeah, just a terrifying scene.
Right. The unmistakable, terrifying drone of bomber planes is vibrating right through your floorboards. You lean forward in the dim light and turn the dial on a small, glowing radio, expecting to hear the latest grim statistics of destruction.
Which is what everyone was tuning in for.
Exactly. But instead, you hear a voice. It's calm, it's conversational, it's witty, even. It's talking to you not about the war raging outside, but about the invisible war raging inside the human heart. Welcome to the Deep Dive. And to you, listening right now, wherever you are, may God bless your day today. I'm your host, ready to jump in.
And I'm your resident expert, thrilled to be here.
Yeah.
Because that vivid image you just painted, it's the absolute necessary starting point for our journey today.
Okay, let's unpack this. We are diving into a truly remarkable set of sources today.
We really are.
We're specifically looking at the author's preface and an introduction by Kathleen Norris to a book that quite literally changed the landscape of modern faith. The book is called Pure and Simple Christianity.
Widely known as Mere Christianity, of course.
Right.
Written by C.S. Lewis.
Right. And our mission today is to understand the alchemy of this book. We want to look at how a series of wartime radio broadcasts delivered under the most extreme psychological and physical pressure imaginable transformed into this timeless, unifying guide to faith.
And perhaps even more intriguingly, we want to examine the architecture of the book itself. Like, why Lewis so deliberately, so carefully avoided taking sides in centuries-old theological debates.
Yeah, because to understand what Lewis is arguing, we really have to anchor ourselves in when and to whom he was speaking.
Exactly.
When your audience might literally die tomorrow, you don't exactly have the luxury of academic posturing.
No, you don't. The year is 1942. Lewis was already intimately familiar with the trauma of global conflict, having survived the horrors of the World War I trenches as a young man.
Oh, right.
And now, he's walking the streets of Great Britain during the 1940 Blitz as an air raid warden.
Which is just, the sky is falling.
Literally.
Yeah.
And he begins giving talks to the men of the Royal Air Force.
And the detail from Kathleen Norris's introduction about those RAF pilots is just staggering. Lewis is standing in front of young men who knew the math of their own survival.
He was grim.
They knew that after just 13 bombing missions, the statistical probability was that they would be declared dead or missing.
13 missions.
Just 13.
Yeah.
You are looking at an audience living with death perched right on their shoulder. How surreal must it have been for a listener tuning their radio, expecting news of death and destruction, to hear this calm voice talking about right and wrong.
Well, what's fascinating here is that this fundamentally changes the nature of the communication.
Yeah.
As Norris points out, what Lewis was producing wasn't academic philosophy.
Right.
It was oral literature for people at war. He uses this incredibly potent metaphor right out of the gate. He describes the world as enemy-occupied territory.
Wow. Yeah, that hits hard.
Right. And for a British population living under nightly bombardment, that wasn't just a clever literary device. It was their immediate, visceral reality.
But Lewis kind of flips that reality on his head, doesn't he? Because the overarching narrative of the early 20th century was this myth of inevitable human progress.
Oh, absolutely.
The idea that science, technology, and enlightenment were just going to naturally march humanity toward this perfect utopia.
Yeah, and the trauma of the war completely shattered that illusion. Lewis argued that all our incredible technological advancements, they weren't enough to end human suffering because they were merely tools.
Just tools.
The real problem isn't external. The real problem, Lewis insists, is within the human heart itself.
Right.
He says, we belong to a corrupt generation that accepts individual and systemic evils as if they are the only options. The machinery of war was really just a magnification of the greed, pride, and cruelty that already existed inside the individual.
So, knowing his audience is staring down their own mortality, and knowing he's trying to diagnose this deep sickness in the human heart, his delivery method becomes absolutely crucial.
Very much so.
Like, he couldn't sound like a lecturer at Oxford. He had to speak the language of the trenches and the living rooms.
And he was obsessive about this. When it came time to adapt these radio talks into the printed book we know today, he was an absolute stickler for keeping the everyday language intact.
Really?
Yeah, he firmly believed that a radio talk should sound like a conversation, not a polished essay being read aloud.
Oh, I remember he actually originally tried using italics in the printed text to replicate the exact vocal emphasis he used on the air, right?
He did, yeah, but he quickly realized it was a mistake.
Too messy.
Yeah, he called it an unwanted hybrid between the art of speaking and the art of writing. He recognized that print and audio are distinct mediums.
Makes sense.
So he removed the italics, but he stubbornly kept the colloquialisms and the contractions. He completely refused to let the publishers sanitize it into formal prose. He wanted that familiar, accessible tone to remain untouched.
Let me push back on that accessible tone for a second, though, because it seems almost counterintuitive when you think about authority.
How so?
Well, Lewis famously calls himself an amateur and a beginner in the preface. He's a layman, a literature professor, and an ex-atheist. Why would people trust him?
It's a fair point.
Why would millions of terrified people in a post-Christian England trust a complete layman to explain the deepest mysteries of the universe to them in their darkest hour?
It's a great question, and it really speaks to the core of Lewis's appeal. His authority didn't come from ecclesiastical credentials. It came from his profound, almost radical empathy and his staggering imagination.
Okay.
Norris points out that Lewis had this deep, driving belief that there is no such thing as an ordinary person. He told his listeners that we work, we joke, and we marry immortals.
Immortals, wow, that completely shifts the center of gravity, doesn't it?
It changes everything. For Lewis, the real religious battle isn't happening on some grand historical stage between nations, or even in the high councils of the church.
Right, it's closer to home.
Exactly. It's happening in the ordinary, everyday human heart when we wake up, make breakfast, and face the pressures of the day. Every single interaction is a shaping of an immortal soul, either towards something heavenly or something hellish.
And he had so much empathy for the struggle of that everyday immortal. There's this specific detail in the text that I found incredibly moving.
The jalopy metaphor.
Yes. Lewis talks about the psychological baggage we all carry. He says that even if someone is, as he puts it, poisoned by a wretched upbringing in a home full of vulgar jealousy and meaningless arguments.
Which so many people are.
Right. He says God sees the old jalopy they were trying to drive. God knows they're operating a broken-down vehicle with faulty steering, and he just asks them to do their best with the machine they've been given.
It's a beautifully humane approach to faith. It acknowledges trauma. It acknowledges that the starting lines for human morality are not equal.
Not at all.
And this intense desire to reach those everyday immortals, the people driving the old jalopies, is exactly why Lewis realized he had to aggressively strip away the complex theological divisions that usually confuse and alienate people.
Which brings us to the architectural core of the book, and arguably one of the most famous analogies in modern religious writing.
The hallway.
The hallway. Lewis compares pure and simple Christianity to a hallway. He says this core common faith isn't an alternative to a specific church.
Right.
You don't choose pure and simple Christianity instead of becoming a Methodist or an Orthodox Greek. Rather, it's the central hallway from which many doors open into different rooms.
And those rooms are the specific denomination.
Exactly.
And he's exceptionally clear about the function of that hallway.
Yeah.
It's not a destination. It's a place to wait, to observe, and to figure out which door has the truth behind it.
I have to admit, when I first read the hallway analogy, I was a bit skeptical.
Oh, really?
Well, think about it. If the truth, the warmth, and the community are all located inside the rooms, isn't Lewis basically saying his own book, The Hallway, is somewhat empty?
I see what you mean.
Right. How does he justify spending an entire book in a space where no one is actually supposed to live?
Well, that is exactly the tension he's managing. He admits you don't live in a hallway. The rooms are where you find the chairs, the fires, and the meals.
Right.
But the hallway is the only place where all the inhabitants of the house can actually meet and recognize their shared foundation. He explicitly urges the listener, don't just pick a door because the paint looks nice or because you like the people standing outside it.
You have to ask, is there truth here? Is there holiness here?
Exactly. And he strictly refused to play tour guide for his own specific room. He was a layman in the Church of England, but he actively refused to offer any help to someone trying to choose between becoming an Anglican, a Roman Catholic, or a Presbyterian.
Because he recognized his own limitations.
Yes. He states that the high theology and ecclesiastical history required to settle those specific denominational debates were deep waters. And he openly confesses, in those deep waters, I cannot help anyone. Rather, I need to be helped.
But wait, if you write a book attempting to capture universal Christianity, and you deliberately avoid all the specific defining doctrines of the different churches,
Yeah.
Doesn't that just guarantee a watered-down, generic document? How did he avoid just writing a list of empty platitudes?
By subjecting his work to a rigorous and frankly unprecedented peer review process.
Oh, right, the clergyman.
Yeah, he was terrified of accidentally presenting his own Anglican bias as universal truth. So before publishing what became Book Two, he sent the original manuscript to 4 different clergymen from completely different traditions to vet it.
He sent it to an Anglican, a Roman Catholic, a Methodist, and a Presbyterian.
Exactly. And the feedback he got is incredibly telling. The Methodist read it and said, "You need to talk more about faith." The Roman Catholic read it and said, "You went way too far in downplaying theories of the atonement."
Let's pause there for a second, because theories of the atonement sounds like heavy academic jargon. For you, the listener who might not be steeped in theology, what exactly is he downplaying here?
It's a crucial point. Atonement theories are essentially the specific theological mechanics of how Christ's sacrifice actually repairs the broken relationship between God and humanity.
Okay, the mechanics of it.
Right. Does it work like a financial transaction paying off a debt? Is it a legal substitution where he takes punishment? Is it a ransom paid to dark forces?
Got it.
Catholics, Protestants, and Orthodox thinkers have debated the precise mechanics of this for centuries. Lewis intentionally steered clear of the how and just focused on the shared belief that it happened.
Which frustrated the Catholic reviewer.
It did.
But, and this is the absolute crux of the experiment, despite their different critiques, all 4 clergymen ultimately agreed that the core manuscript was sound.
The center held up.
It did.
And it confirmed a phenomenon Lewis called odium theologicum, theological hatred. What Lewis found so comforting, and what the peer review process proved, was his realization that the honest, deeply committed believers at the very center of different denominations actually speak the exact same language.
Wow, so the core is unified.
Yes, the hostility, the vitriol, and the hatred almost always come from the fringes, from people who are barely in the community or outside of it entirely.
But keeping that central hallway functional and peaceful required intense discipline. Lewis had to set some very strict boundaries on his language.
Absolutely.
And more importantly, he had to set boundaries on what he absolutely wouldn't talk about. The strategic silences in this book are as loud as the words.
They really are. And some critics thought Lewis staying silent on certain hot-button topics meant he was just on the fence.
Or playing it safe to sell book.
Right. But that wasn't the mechanism at work at all. It wasn't cowardice. It was incredible strategic restraint.
Because he addresses this directly, doesn't he?
He does. He explains that his goal isn't to expose his religion or his personal opinions. His goal is to expose the shared Christianity that existed long before he was born. If a topic doesn't serve that central mission, it gets cut.
The prime example he gives in the text is the Virgin Mary. He knew that was a theological powder keg.
It is perhaps the most explosive area he could have wandered into.
Right. We should be clear, we are not taking sides here, but just looking at why Lewis avoided it.
Exactly, just reporting his reasoning. Lewis explains that saying anything more than the basic historical claim of the virgin birth of Christ would immediately derail the entire project.
Because of the different traditions.
Right. If he diverges from the Catholic view, he risks sounding incredibly insulting. He notes that Catholics defend their beliefs about Mary not just with religious fervor, but with a chivalrous sensitivity.
It's like someone defending the honor of their own mother.
Precisely. You cannot casually disagree without sounding deeply disrespectful.
And on the flip side, if he diverges from the Protestant view, he triggers their absolute deepest historical fears.
Yes. To a radical Protestant, elevating Mary feels like a revival of pagan polytheism. It threatens the core of monotheism for them.
So Lewis rightly assesses the battlefield. He realizes that taking a side here on this one single topic could completely alienate half his audience and ruin a book meant to bring people to the basic belief that Christ is God.
So he stays quiet.
He stays quiet, but his silences weren't just about avoiding theological landmines. They were also profoundly personal and moral.
That's true. He refused to preach about temptations he didn't personally face.
Right, like gambling.
Yeah, he openly states he doesn't have a compulsion for gambling. So he doesn't feel qualified to give advice on the morality of it. He simply doesn't know the texture of that struggle.
He does the same thing with the topic of birth control.
He does.
He explicitly states that because he wasn't a woman, wasn't married, and wasn't a pastor taking confession, he had no business taking a firm stance on pains and burdens that he was personally protected from.
Which is a stunning level of epistemic humility.
It's essentially anti-marketing. I mean, in a world where every pundit has a loud opinion on everything, Lewis says, I'm not in the line of fire for this, so I'm not going to shout instructions from the safety of the rear.
It's so refreshing.
And the psychology of that restraint is brilliant. By actively admitting his blind spots and refusing to speak on minor moral debates, he earns the listener's absolute trust when he does make the massive foundational theological claims.
It establishes immense credibility. He proves he isn't just a talking head. But there was one boundary, one specific piece of linguistic territory that he absolutely refused to surrender.
Oh, I know what you're going to say.
And that was the objective definition of the word Christian itself.
This is easily the most fascinating part of the preface for me. It's a masterclass in the philosophy of language. Lewis warned against spiritualizing or deepening the word Christian until it became so subjective that it meant nothing at all.
Yes.
And to explain the danger, he walks us through the historical degradation of the word gentleman.
Let's trace that linguistic decay, because it perfectly illustrates the trap he's trying to avoid.
So Lewis points out that originally the word gentleman was a purely objective, factual term. It simply meant a man who had a coat of arms and owned a certain amount of land. That's it.
Just a fact.
Right. It wasn't a compliment about his character. It was a socio-economic fact. You could look at a landowner and say, John is a liar and a gentleman.
It wasn't a contradiction.
Not at all, any more than saying James is a fool and he's an American citizen.
Right. It was a verifiable description.
But over time, people started tweaking it. They started saying, but the most important thing about a gentleman isn't the land he owns, it's his behavior. A true gentleman is honorable and polite.
Sounds nice in theory.
Sure, and Lewis says, well, yes, being honorable is objectively better than having a coat of arms. But it's not the same thing. Once gentleman just becomes a word for a guy whose behavior you approve of, it stops being a fact.
It just becomes a vague compliment.
Exactly. It just means someone you like. The word becomes completely useless for conveying actual information.
And Lewis argues that if we allow society to spiritualize the word Christian in that exact same way, it will face the exact same disastrous fate. If an unbeliever uses the word Christian to just mean a good man, it doesn't enrich the language at all. We already have the word good.
It's exactly like what happened to the word literally in our modern culture.
Oh, that's a great comparison.
Right. It used to mean something strictly objective, that an event actually happened exactly as described, without metaphor. But we spiritualized it to just mean very or intensely.
Right. People started saying, I literally died laughing.
And now the word is so degraded that dictionaries actually include its exact opposite meaning as a secondary definition.
This was wild.
Lewis is warning against that exact same linguistic decay, but with eternal stakes.
That is a perfect modern parallel. And to fight against that decay, Lewis points us back to the historical origin of the term. He notes that the name Christian was first used in Antioch, as recorded in Acts chapter 11, verse 26, to describe the disciples.
The early believers.
Specifically, it described those who accepted the teaching of the apostles. It's objective. It's about accepting a specific set of doctrines. Lewis argues that we cannot see into people's hearts to judge who is closest to the Spirit of Christ.
We aren't God.
Exactly. It's arrogant to even try to use the word that way.
Right. He says if a person accepts the objective Christian doctrines but acts terribly in their personal life, it is much more accurate and much more helpful to call them a bad Christian than to declare they aren't a Christian.
Exactly. You preserve the objective meaning of the word, and in doing so, you actually hold them accountable to the very standard they claim to accept.
It all comes back to clarity. Lewis was building a hallway, but he was building it with clear, sturdy, objective walls.
He really was.
He spoke directly to a traumatized generation surrounded by death, offering them not a superficial, fluffy escape, but a profound lens through which to view their own terrifying humanity.
He took the chaos of the Blitz and gave people a framework to understand their own souls.
He respected them enough to treat them not as statistics, but as immortals fighting a cosmic battle inside their own ordinary hearts.
It's just brilliant.
And there is so much more of that framework to explore. As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to make sure you, our listener, know that we are not done with this incredible source. There will be a brand new deep dive coming up that continues exploring this very same book, Pure and Simple Christianity.
Lots more to cover.
Definitely. But before we go, we want to leave you with one final thought from Lewis to just mull over.
It goes back to that profound idea of the immortals we are all slowly becoming, shaped by the everyday choices we make in the hallway and in the rooms we eventually inhabit. Looking at the grand sweep of history, and the quiet battles of the human heart. Lewis observed this. He said, "How monotonously alike have been all the great tyrants and conquerors. How gloriously different all the saints."
That's a beautiful place to leave it. God blesses all the listeners.